When naval circles discuss naval battles of the First World War, focus is often placed on the German and British battlecruisers because they often went head-to-head, and the results of these battles were very interesting. By the time World War I had concluded, only one German battlecruiser, Lutzow, had been sunk, while 3 British ones had been sunk, Invincible, Indefatigable, and Queen Mary. Subsequently, it also has to be pointed out that all 4 of these battlecruisers were lost within the same battle, the Battle of Jutland, and so a 3-to-1 ratio seemed really good, and that means the conclusion must be drawn that the Germans achieved their primary goal when designing their battlecruisers, and that was individual superiority, since they could not keep up with the quantity game. Drawing this conclusion solely based on the results of the Battle of Jutland is not very sound, because the British battlecruisers were not necessarily lost as a result of design deficiencies, but rather of ordnance complications, namely the cordite, which was greatly unstable, and depending on whether a shell penetrated a magazine or the magazines were hindered by flash and fire, the cordite's unstable nature resulted in them exploding. Because of that, I think it's important that we take a deep dive into the designs of the German and British battlecruisers, actually comparing the individual superiority between both sides and seeing if the German battlecruisers were actually superior to their British counterparts, and if they were, how much of an edge did they have. To start this analysis, I think it's necessary to name off the ships that I will be focusing on. For the Germans, it will be the 1 von der Tonn, the 2 Moltkas, the 1 Seydlitz, and the 3 Derflingers. For the British, it's the 3 Invincibles, 3 Indefatigables, 2 Lions, 1 Queen Mary, 1 Tiger, and 2 Renowns. I am not including Hood because it was not completed until after World War I. Firstly, I want to look at seakeeping and maneuverability, since these are some of the crucial components as to why the battlecruiser even existed. For the German ships, they often had a higher metacentric height. This allowed them to have greater stability for gunnery purposes, as the rolling period was sharp but short in comparison to their British counterparts. For example, the von der Tonn had a metacentric height of 2.11 meters, while its competitor Invincible had a metacentric height of only 4 feet, which is about 2/3 that of von der Tonn's. There's only one point in the Anglo-German naval race where the metacentric height actually closes between one another, and this is with the Derflinger class and the Queen Mary and Tiger, as the Derflingers had a metacentric height of 2.6 meters, while Queen Mary and Tiger had a metacentric height of 6 feet, which was just shy of the German ships. Out of all of these classes, the worst gun platform as far as rolling goes was undoubtedly the Invincibles. Their roll period would have been longer, which meant targeting had to take into account where the ship would be during its period of roll over a greater period of time. Even though the Invincibles had the longest roll period of all of the ships on the board, none of the ships seemed to be hampered as far as gunnery is concerned with their roll periods, and overall, the Germans do have the slight edge here, but in a practical sense, this advantage is almost non-existent. Now let's move over to maneuverability, taking into account shaft horsepower and maximum speed. For this, I'm going to be taking the lead ship of each class and their best performance during steam trials. For the German ships, their performance was relatively uniform, keeping within the high 70 and high 80,000 shaft horsepower limit, which exceeded their design expectations. This allowed them to have a maximum speed in the mid to high 20s, which gave them roughly a 6-knot advantage over the standard German battleship. Unfortunately, during wartime, the quality of the coal that the Germans were able to supply their ships was reduced, and as a result, the power produced by the machinery was also reduced, and the maximum speed subsequently fell. It remained lower than their steam trials and irregular throughout the war. As for the British, we have a significant difference. The first 2 classes of ship produced less power than their German counterparts, but retained similar speeds. From Lion onward, the British continually upped the power, keeping it similar to the Germans until the final class, and subsequently they increased the speed greatly, surpassing that of the latest German battlecruisers. As for wartime coal supply, the Royal Navy's coal had higher quality than that of the Germans, and as a result, during practical experience, the British battlecruisers were able to achieve their maximum speed regularly. This is a category where the British ships undeniably have the edge and the advantage. During the battles of Dogger Bank and Jutland, the British were able to close and disengage from the Germans at their own given time and choosing, while the Germans simply had to sit through the actions that the British were making. The British battlecruisers had full control of when a battle occurred and when a battle concluded. Another category I wanted to discuss under maneuverability was the turning circle radius for each ship. However, I don't have reliable numbers for the British battlecruisers, so I will simply supply the German numbers, and there will be no comparison for this topic. The next category we are going to tackle is the armament, as this is one of the most important, if not the single most important component to the battlecruiser's offensive capabilities. Due to the political struggles of designing warships during the Anglo-Naval-German race, the Germans were always handicapped in regards to the maximum bore size that was allocated towards their battlecruisers and battleships alike. As a result, they often had slightly smaller guns than their British counterparts. However, these weapons were of higher caliber, which gave them greater accuracy and penetrating power when compared to the British guns. But due to the design of the turret mountings of the German ships, they had less firing range because they could not elevate very high. As for the British, during each stage of the race, their battlecruisers always had greater bore diameter guns than that of the Germans, though they had less caliber length, which in theory would make them ever so slightly less accurate with less penetrating power if the Germans were using the same bore diameter. However, in a practical sense, due to the British constantly having the larger gun, they actually retained greater penetrating power and produced more damage upon a successful penetration and shell detonation than their German counterparts. There is a major exception to this rule, and that is in the type of shell that the British were using, as they had two armor-piercing shells. Powder-filled ones, which were similar to that of the German shells, and the one they had particular favoritism towards, lyddite-filled shells, which were not very good at penetrating thick armor, but they were great at disrupting multiple mechanical components at one time, and they were also excellent at destroying segments of ship that were not armored at all. When it comes to the secondary armament, the Germans utilized the 15cm gun for all of their battlecruisers, and as a result, this uniform battery was excellent at dealing with light targets such as cruisers and torpedo boats. They had all-round excellent fields of fire, and they were also protected behind armored casemates. As for the British, the majority of their battlecruisers were equipped with 4-inch guns, which by the time of World War I were considered obsolete and relatively ineffective against modern cruisers and destroyers. The only exception to this rule was HMS Tiger, which was equipped with 6-inch guns, and these were protected behind casemates, while the 4-inch guns of all of the other battlecruisers were either unprotected or had thin gun shields. There are other weapons equipped to the battlecruisers for both sides, like torpedoes. However, I'm not going to go over them here because they were never utilized in battle and subsequently make no impact as far as a comparison is concerned. As far as the primary armament is concerned between the navies, the British had the clear advantage. As for the secondary armament, with the exception of Tiger, the Germans had the clear advantage, but even when compared to Tiger, the German ships had better fields of fire and better protection for their secondary guns. Rating artillery all in all is very difficult because weather conditions and gunnery impacts the efficiency of the weapons supplied, and so while on paper the British ships have the superior guns, in practical use, there are various conditions that could give the Germans the advantage or the British the advantage. So, for this category, it's safe to consider both sides relatively equal, but the British have a very slight advantage. Now for the category that I'm sure most people are waiting for, protection, specifically armor. This is a more complex category to tackle than meets the eye, as the two navies designed their ships behind two different ideas of defending their ships. For the Germans, the armoring of their ships was to prevent damage from occurring in spaces as often as possible, and in order to achieve this, the thickest possible armor plate was to be installed at each given point. The armor between the different classes of battlecruiser at this time period were very irregular and unevenly dispersed, and so I'm only going to be supplying a diagram on screen of one ship for each navy. In this case, you are looking at the Derflinger, with the measurements being in millimeters. Some important figures regarding the Derflinger that gives the general idea of how the Germans laid out their armor is that you'll notice the main armor belt has a maximum thickness of 300 millimeters over machinery and magazine spaces, though its lower edge tapered down to 150 millimeters. The armored deck had an average thickness of 30 millimeters, though at its maximum thickness it could get up to 80 millimeters, though these were very small segments over top the main battery magazines. There's also armor plate protecting the bow and stern of the ship, where no vitals are necessarily located, with the exception being the steering gears at the stern, and the average armor thickness for the bow and stern was 100 millimeters, though there is a slight section of the bow that has 120 millimeters. Now if we go over to the British, their concept behind protecting the ships was not to prevent shells from entering the vessel, but rather to limit the amount of damage the ship received once a shell penetrated and successfully detonated. The reason that the British went down this path is because, at the estimated battle ranges being below 10,000 meters, they fully understood that there was no real armor thicknesses that would be able to withstand large caliber gunfire, and so putting the maximum thickness of armor on a ship simply made no sense. The ship that you see on your screen is HMS Tiger, since, out of all of the early British battlecruisers, the Tiger had the thickest armor values compared to all of the other British battlecruisers. You'll notice that the British placed special emphasis on protecting the machinery spaces, as the main belt was 9 inches over top propulsion. However, around main magazines, it reduced to 5 inches. The main armor deck is primarily comprised of 1-inch plating. However, over top the primary magazines, there are small segments of 3-inch plating, but it must be emphasized that this is not armor plating, but protective plating. The concept behind the protective plating was that it would prevent splinters and shrapnel from penetrating the deck and entering vital spaces after a shell successfully exploded. However, if a shell plunged down onto the deck, it was not meant to resist a full penetration. You'll also notice that it has 4-inch armor plating over the bow and stern, where no vitals of the ship were located, and Tiger was the best protected ship as far as the bow and stern are concerned. Most British battlecruisers did not have stern protection, and the bow protection did not extend as far forward as it does on Tiger. So, it's clear by comparing the two navies' armoring schemes that the Germans have a clear advantage in numerical values on paper. When placing the armor into a practical battle scenario, it's more difficult to measure which side had the advantage. This is generally where the 3 British battlecruisers exploding at Jutland come into play, but they are more difficult to use in an armor comparison analysis than one might expect, because we don't actually know where the fatal shell hit. We will never be able to tell from those 3 ships whether their armor failed them, their crew's safety procedures failed them, or their own safety systems failed them. What we do know is that other British battlecruisers sustained heavy damage, with most emphasis being placed on Lion, as it received excessive punishment at both the battles of Dogger Bank and Jutland, and as for the German battlecruisers, another good comparison would be the Seydlitz, which also received extensive damage at the battles of Dogger Bank and Jutland, like Lion. This video is not going to provide an in-depth analysis to the damage that the vessels received during battle, as that's an extensive and independent topic on its own that could make an entirely separate video. But for the case of this video, I will say that the British concept seemed to have more merits than people give it credit for, as when the German ships received large caliber gun hits on its armor plating, the armor was often dislodged, holed, and components on the opposite side were often damaged. Even though the armor plate was effective at keeping shells out for the most part, it was not effective at keeping the force and impact of a shell out from the ship, and ultimately the German ships suffered just as much in damage as the British, if not more in some cases. So in my opinion, the final rating regarding the armor between the two navies is that they are relatively tied, though the Germans have a slight edge simply because they do have those thicker armor values. Another component to the defensive systems of these ships was their torpedo defense systems, which for the Germans, they had a proper torpedo bulkhead that ran abreast the primary magazines and propulsion machinery, leaving only the bow and stern unprotected. This torpedo defense system saw use multiple times throughout the war on various classes of battlecruisers and battleships, and each time it proved successful. As for the British battlecruisers, they did not have a proper torpedo defense system, only having torpedo bulkheads abreast the primary magazines, and on average, these bulkheads were armored upwards of 2.5 inches. As for the machinery spaces, it was expected that the longitudinal bulkheads that formed the coal bunkers would be used as the torpedo defense system, though this was not a proper torpedo bulkhead. As far as I recall, the only British battlecruiser that we're looking at today that was ever struck by underwater weapons was HMS Repulse, but this occurred in World War II after it had torpedo bulges fitted, and so it falls outside the criteria of this video. Regardless, I think it's safe to say that the Germans had the clear advantage here, especially since the torpedo defense system saw practical use multiple times during World War I without a single ship being lost as a result of flooding from torpedoes or mines. The next category that I think is worth mentioning is habitability, as this impacts the morale and comfort of the crew on board the ships. This is an extensive topic. It incorporates space supplied for the crew, ventilation, quarters, food, water, etc., etc. Due to the massive scope of topics that this category envelops, I'm not going to be giving specific numbers, but rather explaining the approach each navy took when targeting habitability. For the Germans, they recognized that their navy would mainly be operating out of European waters, as they did not have a massive worldwide empire that their navy would ever need to be called to, and as a result, their ships were often smaller and carried less provisions than that of the British. Meanwhile, the British recognized they had a worldwide empire, and their ships would not always be expected to operate out of a European port, as sometimes they would need to operate out of the Americas or a Pacific port. As a result, the British battlecruisers were usually larger, carried more provisions, and had slightly more extensive ventilation systems, because they had to operate over larger areas of sea for greater periods of time than their German counterparts were expected to. So as far as habitability is concerned, the British ships were slightly superior to that of the German ones, but this was mainly done as a result of international circumstances and not necessarily because the Germans wanted more uncomfortable crews than the British. The final category I want to tackle for this video is damage control, specifically with flooding, as fire control between the two navies was relatively similar. The German battlecruisers combated flooding through a system referred to as the leak pump system. This system was comprised of 2 pipes that ran at the bottom of the ship, one to starboard and one to port, for which water could drain down into. Once water had entered the drainage pipes, there were then 3 centrifugal pumps, which had different arrangements depending on the battlecruiser we're looking at, that would force the water out of the drainage system and back into the sea. If the pumps were not capable of keeping up with the onrush of water, the ship's main condensers could also be connected to the draining system. As for the British, they also had drainage pipes in the bottom of the ship that water would enter, and connected to the drainage pipes was a variety of different pumps. Usually, the engine rooms had 4 pumps, the boiler rooms had 3 pumps, and throughout various spaces outside the propulsion system, there was usually about a dozen further pumps. Like the German ships, the main condensers could also be connected to the drainage system and assist in pumping water out. It's clear that the British pumping system was far more expensive and focused more on the compartmentalization of the ship rather than covering the entire length of the ship. The Germans would come to realize, specifically following the battles of Dogger Bank and Jutland, that their pumping system was not up to the task of taking on large quantities of water, and this contributed to the loss of Lützow and the near losses of Seydlitz and Derfflinger. The German drainage system also failed to connect to the primary magazines. So, after the Battle of Dogger Bank, when Seydlitz's D and C magazines were flooded to prevent the ship from exploding, the water remained in the magazines until the ship reached port. For this category, it's clear that the British ships had a significant advantage, both because they had a greater number of pumps and because the German ships suffered greatly as a result of flooding during battle. That concludes all of the categories I wish to cover regarding the British and German battlecruisers, as in my opinion, those categories encompass the primary components that comprise a battlecruiser. It's clear from this comparison that both the German and British placed much effort into carefully designing their battlecruisers, and ultimately, these are probably some of the most important and well-designed ships of the First World War. However, I think it's worth mentioning that the Germans' attempt to outdo British quantity with quality does not seem to be met to the standard they're often accredited to. For the most part, both navies' battlecruisers were hindered by similar complications, but the British battlecruisers were better equipped to counter those complications when compared to the Germans. The only real point that the British battlecruisers are let down is with the quality of the propellant charges. However, this falls outside the scope of the ship's actual design. So to put that answer simply, the German battlecruisers were not of higher quality than their British counterparts, but they weren't bad either. In reality, both sides were more comparable than is often recognized. With that having been said, I have nothing more I wish to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.